All right, folks, part 22 of my collection. And we're getting to the bottom row here. And the top of the bottom row, I got two books. Oh, three, excuse me. I've got Sartre's Existentialism and Human Emotions. Meh. Very short volume and very short indeed. Not very good. I would not recommend it on any level. All right, here's a pretty good biography of Caligula. A little bit more of a critical analysis and less of a takedown of a so-called monstrous Caesar, emperor, whatever you want to call him. And yes, he wasn't all good. He did some bad things, much like any other imperial leader. He's bloodthirsty. But was he as bloodthirsty as any of the others? That's up for debate. Okay, next up is a very interesting book by Jacques Derrida, Glass. And this is an interesting work where he juxtaposes the work of Hegel with the prose and some of the technique, lyrical stuff in the novels of Jean Genet, which is incredibly interesting. This is probably Derrida's best work, because as you're reading it, you start to realize that there's a dialectic between the work of Hegel and his dialectical idealism that brings in the material world, and Genet's a very materialistic but ideal prose. There's an incident in one of his poems. It's in the Thief's Journal by Genet, where he talks about walking over a frontier and how mystical frontiers are and how very real they are, especially to a criminal who's on the run. And it's very interesting stuff. You get to basically Hegel tried to rectify materialism in the idealist structure of his dialectic, whereas Genet tried to refigure his reality that he experienced daily into an ideal and poetic realm of materialism. And it's really interesting. There's one scene in a Genet novel, and I think it's Miracle de the Rose, where a great murderer, well, in Genet's word, a great murderer, basically is pulled out in chains to the scaffold to get his head chopped off, and to Genet, seeing those chains, he saw them as roses draped around an ancient sacrificial victim for the gods, and his head lopped off. Instead of blood pouring out of his neck or head or whatever, it wasn't blood. It was wine, and infused with roses too. And it's a very, very incredible scene. So it's not out of the realm of any thought to juxtapose Hegel with Jean Genet, the great French poet and playwright and novelist. And again, this is a very interesting work. Really, what you take from it is the interesting nature of the juxtaposition. It's incredible, and it's pretty lengthy too. I mean, it's like a big painting book, but it's filled with prose. And the Genet work is in larger print, generally in larger print than the Hegel stuff, which is more more normalized and less out of bounds, I guess the thing about it is the boundaries of Hegel and the boundary breaking of Genet, which is incredible. A nice juxtaposition. And I'm not even a big fan of Derrida, whatever you want to pronounce it. Okay, this is a 1926, who's the publisher? Set of Boni and Liveright of New York. It's in pretty good condition, except for the boards are kind of faded. The great novel, The Thibauts, a Family, but that's not part of the title, but The Thibauts, by Roger Martin Dugard. And this is a really excellent novel. It's pretty good. I mean, it's overshadowed by, of course, Proust, whatever you want to call it, and some other French novelists. But it's a pretty excellent novel. It's an old hardbound edition. It's a pretty good work. I recommend it. Next up, classic, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So many, people have read this, and is it the fable of the new Prometheus? Is it this? Is it that? Why don't we just take it as a story of a man, the doctor making the monster and seeing what's going on? Of course, in the 19th century, there were a lot of fears. And you go from, the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century of where alchemy and a lot of other things are going into science. Basically, the origins of science in Europe were forged in alchemy and a lot of other esoteric practices. And in the 19th century, a lot more rationalism came into it, but we figured out that the rationalism was just as could be just as zany to carry to certain, and especially in Bentham and Panopticon kind of stuff. It can be just as terrible and abusive as the esoteric practices of all the other stuff that went before it. So it's a very interesting work in the historical context. It's a brilliant novel. Mary Shelley did well. By the way, she was helped out a lot because I think the old tale about her and Byron and Polidori and were telling horror tales, and basically Byron came up with the skeleton, not the plot, but the skeletal beginnings of what became Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. She freely admits it. He came up with the skeletal idea, but he didn't write the book. So I'm not trying to take any credit away from Mary Shelley. And that's all I'm going to say about that. It's an excellent book. I recommend it every way. Probably everyone, a lot of people have read it, and they should. It's a really good book. Okay, here's another classic, The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky, with the awesome ending with Alyosha stepping out. It's really a big book. I mean that in every sense of the word. It is just an incredible work with, the Grand Inquisitor and all that stuff that everybody knows about. But it's just an incredible work about a family, and I mean, you can't say enough about it. And I'm not going to bore people with my own stuff. Next up, excellent volume, Sir Walter Raleigh, his selected writings. Some of these contain some of his first foray, his poetry, his letters, and also his accounts of his exploration in the Western Hemisphere and the discovery of Guyana. And he didn't discover it, of course, but he discovered it for England. I mean, he was the first Englishman there. And he basically talked about the animals there and the topography and all that other stuff. And interesting stuff. And even his letters and also some of his other stuff. His History of the World is the fragment from his History of the World is pretty good. Raleigh was a sharp guy. He was no slouch when it came to writing. He just devoted himself more to court stuff and adventure. And he was a wealthy nobleman, so he had every opportunity to do such things. But this book, Selected Writings, I'd recommend it. Penguin edition. It's easy to get. It's very interesting. Next up is a novel from the 1960s, 70s Miguel Angel Asturias, and this is called The President. It's about corruption in a South American or Central American, Latin American country. He was born in Guatemala. I'm sure he knew about all the intrigues and stuff foisted upon them mainly by northern neighbors. And this is a pretty good book. I highly recommend it. It's about tyranny, folks. Something that's very still common in this world. All right, next up is an old, crusty old modern library edition of, it's titled Rothschild's Fiddle, but it's a series of, basically it's a series of short stories by Anton Chekhov, of course. You got The Hollow, Expensive Lessons on Trial, Segal, La Segal, and all this other stuff. This is Modern Library, and it was sold by Macy and Co., and I think it was printed in 1930 or something. And yeah, it's translated in 1916, so it could be from earlier than that. But it doesn't really say. Good stuff. Chekhov's short story is always great. Here is another edition that I bought, and a really nicer version of Goethe's Conversations with, Eckermann's Conversations with Goethe. This is an Everyman Library edition. And even though it looks slim, a slim volume, the paper is very thin. And there's like over nearly 450 pages of this. And it's really interesting. Goethe had a lot of great things to say. And this is towards the end of his life. It starts in 1823. And I believe he was born in 1749, if I'm not mistaken. But it's a really neat picture of Goethe in his regular life and the things, and how wide-ranging his interests were. Just a brilliant man. Scientist, botanist, writer, poet, playwright, novelist, all of it. He did it all, folks. Okay. Guilty pleasure here. One of my favorite novels of all time. Charlotte Bronte's. Poignant, beautiful, and sad. Charlotte Bronte's Villette, however you want to pronounce it. Excellent novel. Charlotte Bronte is just an outstanding writer of prose. Her novels are very good. And this is probably her best, although it is not the most famous. And I'm not saying that to be a contrarian. I'm just saying it because it's true. Villette is probably her best novel by far. It is a very, very poignant story of a governess/teacher who falls in love with a man, and then that's all I'm going to say. It's a very, very, it's a simple story, but it's the intricacies of it and stuff are just wonderful. Great, great book. Next up, short volume, John Mead Faulkner's The Lost Stradivarius. And this is a ghost story. And it's very occult, and it's very good, and it's very entertaining. And it's it's not a very well-known book nowadays. Back in the day, I guess, when it was first published, it was pretty popular. And this is a very, very good novel of intrigue. Very short. It's not going to bore you. A lot of interesting stuff. Next up, book about Miguel de Unamuno, The Tragic Sense of Life. And if you thought Schopenhauer was a pessimist, well then, my friend, this fan of Schopenhauer is taking the baton and running it further. And this is a more religious. In Schopenhauer's the world is will and representation, or idea, whatever it's titled. There's a lot of Hindu quotes in it, a lot of Eastern myths and religion. theology. The Tragic Sins of Life is more of a Catholic writing these things, and also there's everything from Luther and Kant to this, and it's basically a book about it's in the essence of Catholicism, and it's a philosophical work of pessimism, more based in faith, in the that sense, and not as I don't want to say bitter, but not as acerbic as Schopenhauer's. Okay, next up is an excellent book by Roland Barthes called Mythologies. Very short volume. Talks about the nature of myths and how they're used in different ways. And it's pretty good. It gives you a new appreciation of myth. And basically the first chapter starts off with professional wrestling, which is very interesting because professional wrestling, the good guy, bad guy motif and all that stuff, is so much based in our myths and in mythology. Okay, next up, Dostoevsky, Notes from the Underground and The Double. These are two excellent. I would call them novellas. You could call them short stories, whatever you want to call them. Very good stuff, very of the times. Dostoevsky gets into the character of Russia at the time, especially with Notes from Underground. And I can tell you that Nietzsche, the hack that he was, read Dostoevsky and loved him because a lot of Nietzsche's philosophy springs from Notes from Underground. I can tell you that right away. Anyone can tell you that. And yeah, I am a sick man, I am an angry man, and I am an unattractive man. Friedrich Nietzsche was sick when he wrote all his philosophical works. He was suffering from syphilis and other things. He was a very sickly man, took a lot of laudanum, opium, and all that stuff. So, not to impugn Nietzsche, but I'm just saying that Dostoevsky was very influential, incredibly influential. And it's not Dostoevsky's fault. He was basically, there was a lot of anarchism and a lot of discontent in the Russia of his time. And he wrote about it clearly. All right, here's a volume from Loeb Library, Claudian. And this contains, wow, it's even got a inventory, 1983, Norman, Harry, Eugene, Himmerling, Christensen. Well, they had a hyphen name. That means they're important. He even has a little, there we go. Has a little stamp right here. From the library of, well, I got it, folks. Sorry. This is the second volume of his collected works. It's got panegyrics. It's got history, like on Stilicho's consulship, panegyric on the sixth consulship of the Emperor Honorius, the Gothic War, shorter poems, the Rape of Proserpine, which is a longer form. And again, this is from the late Roman Empire. And it's good stuff. It's interesting. You will not be bored by it, except for the Stilicho's consulship stuff. A lot of... Okay, here we go with the guy that I've talked a lot about, Cicero. And this is a collection of his speeches. Again, Loeb Library. You got his the speeches of Cicero, or Cicero, however you want to pronounce it. If you want to be a purist, you could go Cicero, blah, 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 blah. Speech on behalf of Archias the poet. Introduction to the speeches delivered by Cicero after his return from exile. The speech delivered before the Senate after his return from exile. Another speech before the people after his return from exile. And then a speech concerning his house delivered before the College of Pontiffs. That's when he was brought up for, taking money from the government to pay for his house and stuff. He was abusing the treasury. Speech concerning his response to the soothsayers. Speech on behalf of Gnaeus Plancius. Good stuff. I mean, he was a good orator. A lot of orators after him studied him and copied him. Okay, next up is another book by Cicero, Letters to Atticus again, Iterum Crispinus. And these are letters to Atticus that he wrote. Yeah, here we go. All these letters to Atticus that he wrote. And that's about it. I've already discussed it. I have a huge penguin volume of it. Okay, here's another Dostoevsky, another excellent work, The House of the Dead. Of course, this is about his time in the prison camps. And the characters of other convicts, the conditions they lived in. Probably up there with some of the best prison writing. It's a really excellent work. I highly recommend it. And next up, Michelangelo, Poems and Letters. And not only was he a great painter, a sculptor, all that other stuff he did, he was a great poet. Pretty good. I mean, hey. Oh, love is deaf and blind to dying and to time, and still, though I am facing death, calls her to mind. I only make this prayer, you should not think despair, one single wound inflicted by your bow. Even if you break it in 1,000 pieces, he never dies whose suffering never ceases. Good stuff. Michelangelo is very romantic. Before his time. Okay, here's a volume. The Scandal by Alarcon. I've read better books. But it's not bad. It's entertaining. It's not up there with Alfred de Musset and all those other people, but it's pretty good. Okay, here's an interesting volume. History of Political Thought, the Middle Ages. And hey, politics happened in the Middle Ages. It wasn't so dark as you think it was. And it was very interesting. And there was a lot of high statesmanship in that era. And of course, the foundation was the big bully in the room was the papacy. Of course, some went against the papacy, against, whatever, and that kind of cost them a little bit. And very interesting stuff, very interesting times. They call them the Dark Ages. I don't know why. Maybe it's because so many people were ignorant about the Middle Ages. I think that's why. Okay, this is an awesome work. And so much of Western literature is built upon this work, especially poetry and plays and some other stuff. And it's Ovid, Publius Ovidius Naso. Ovid, we call him, or Ovid, however you want to say it. The Metamorphoses. And again, this is a Penguin translation in prose. I got one in poetic form somewhere, but that really doesn't matter. You can still read it in prose. Great stories. All the myths are here. Not all of them, but much of them are. And it's very well written. Good stuff. Excellent. Highly recommend it. All right, next up is a short volume of short stories by Leonardo Sciascia, the great Sicilian writer. And these are some excellent stories. Trial by Violence, Mafia Western, A Matter of Conscience, Endgame, Gufa, The Test, The Wine Dark Sea, and The Ransom. And there's one novel in here about two cities that, where is it at? I don't know which one it is. I think it's A Matter of Conscience is the one. Good stuff. Really good stuff. All right. Here's one by Snow. C.P. Snow, Red Star Over China. Basically about Mao and his march and the basic policies of communism and some of the great men who started it. And he was there to witness it. And Red Horizons. Good stuff. Good stuff. Red Star Over China. Recommend it. All right, next up is a wonderful novel. I'm going to try to get to the end of this row. It's called Autumn Sonata. It's a collection of poems by Georges Trakl, who was an excellent poet. Died young, tragically. Great stuff. You have it in German and in English. And really great stuff. Highly recommended. If you can get Trackle, get your hands on Trackle, please do so. He's a great poet. All right, next up is a volume of short stories by Guy de Maupassant. Again, he's a great writer. He can do anything. He can write short stories. He can do novels. Good stuff. Excellent. Okay, after that, next up is Zola's The Lady's Paradise, Au Bonheur des Dames. And this is a great novel about a guy who owns a shop, a large store. It's the beginning of those kind of things. And it's a very excellent novel. It's not one of his more famous ones. Au Bonheur des Dames. Yeah. Mouret's sole passion was the conquest of woman. He wanted her to be queen in his shop. He had built this temple for her in order to hold her at his mercy. His tactics were to intoxicate her with amorous attentions, to trade on her desires. Basically, it's about marketing and about getting people to spend their money, which is a passion. Everybody knows this, but they deny it. Next up is a series of short stories by a great French writer, Prosper Mérimée, Carmen and Other Stories. Great stylist, Lokis, Colomba, Divina Seville, came back at Backgammon, The Etruscan Vase, Tamango, and of course Matteo Falcon and Carmen. These are all great works, meticulously written, excellent stuff. Can't say enough about Mérimée. Good stuff. Next up, Turgenev, Fathers and Sons, the classic that everybody knows about Bazarov and his up and his dangerous radical nihilist friend. And of course, Turgenev is just sending everybody a warning about these upstarts. But the most intriguing character and the funniest character in this is Uncle Pavel, who's so shocked by these guys who are basically powerless and just, they talk a tough game, but they're not going to do anything. It's kind of funny. Pavel is like really stuffy and, classical. It's pretty funny. I think Turgenev in a way sends up himself a little bit, or the ideal of himself that other writers have, which is never true. Turgenev was pretty ahead of his time. Okay, great work. Sallust, Cataline's War, the Jugurthine War, and histories. Of course, these involve certain Roman histories or whatever. The Jugurthine War is about a war in North Africa, and Cataline's War was basically Cataline's social war. Catiline rising up against the senatorial class. He was Caesar before Caesar. Catiline was friends with Caesar. Okay, next up is an excellent account of the United States by a Soviet poet, Vladimir Mayakovsky, My Discovery of America. This is a great book to read. And this was in the 20s, I believe, the 1920s, teens. And at the end, there's a great poem. But the prose is also great too. And America just wasn't the United States. It was also, he went to Mexico too. He went to Chicago, New York, and all these other places. And basically his thoughts on them. But he also gives credit to Mexico, as being part of North America, which it is. And America is just more than the United States. It's Canada. It's the United States. It's Mexico. It's all of Central America and South America. Those are the Americas, baby. That's why it annoys me when people say, I live in America. Well, where do you live? There's so many countries. South, Central, North. And which one in North America? Which one in Central America? Which one in South America? Yeah, I'm that asshole that does that. All right, here's a great book by Henry Mayhew, London Labour and the London Poor. This is a very groundbreaking work. He talks about the people of the streets in a time when it was very prevalent, and there in London, vagrants and skilled and unskilled labor, street musicians, the destroyers of vermin. And this is a very humanist work. It's an outstanding work, and it's a work that I'm glad he did, because he basically talked about the hard lives that the people who work and the poor had in London at the time, when there was a lot of wealth being amassed by the empire all over the world. This was written in, I believe, when was this written? To give you a certain idea of when it was first published. Oh, and they don't tell me, and I don't know why. All right, here we are. Hold on, because they have a chronology. Okay, all 4 volumes are in here, and it was a in 1861 to 1862, but he compiled the information in the 1850s, 1850 to 1852, and then he got the work and he published it in 1860, 1862. Very seminal work, and it created a lot of likewise works. I think he was one of the first in Western civilization to do such a work. In basically describing a worker's life and what they went through and stuff, and the poor too, focused on. Okay. Last but not least, John Stuart Mill on Liberty. Yeah. This work, I read it. I've heard so much about it. It's a short work. And much like his autobiography, it really depressed me. Because his ideals of liberty are so straitjacketed and contained, much like his life, sadly, because he was a brilliant man. It's a very boring work, and it's very constraining, and it's amazing that such a turgid work could be about liberty. Not that I expect poetic effusions and panegyrics and song and all that other stuff and celebrations, but he could have put a little bit more humanity into it. But that was never his forte, not even in his life. Not that he was a bad man, but that he was a very utilitarian man. And that's all I'm going to say. That's it for this. Of course, much like the other bookshelf, there's books in the back, but if I had to go through all those, I would be doing this for 10 years. And I'm not going to do this. Next up, I'm going to do some stacks. And you folks have a nice day, and thank you for your patience.